Here is the story translated into English for native speakers. Emily, a 28-year-old writer, decided to spend autumn in a secluded cottage in the Vermont woods to finish her novel. The two-story wooden house, surrounded by ancient pines, seemed like the perfect place for creativity and inspiration. October days were getting shorter, and nights colder and darker. Emily had grown accustomed to the silence and solitude, enjoying the sounds of nature and the crackling of firewood in the evenings. That day, the weather suddenly turned foul. Heavy clouds covered the sky and a piercing wind picked up. By evening, a violent thunderstorm broke out. Rain lashed against the windows, tree branches scratched the roof. Emily sat at her laptop in the living room, immersed in work on her latest chapter. Suddenly, the electricity flickered and went out. The house plunged into darkness, with only flashes of lightning occasionally illuminating the room. Emily sighed, took out candles and a flashlight. She knew the fuse box was in the basement and decided to check if the circuit breakers had tripped. Descending the creaky stairs to the basement, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The flashlight beam picked out the outlines of old furniture and boxes from the darkness. Reaching the fuse box, she was surprised to find the main switch down. Emily flipped it up, and the lights in the house came back on. Climbing back upstairs, she noticed wet footprints on the basement floor. Emily's heart began to race. She knew for certain she hadn't been down there earlier. Looking around, the writer saw a window slightly ajar through which rainwater was seeping in. Emily hastily closed the window and returned to the living room, trying to convince herself that nothing terrible had happened. The wind must have blown open the old window. However, a feeling of unease wouldn't leave her. The night was restless. Emily kept waking up to the sound of thunder and howling wind. Towards morning, she thought she heard footsteps on the first floor. Holding her breath, the writer listened. A barely discernible creaking of floorboards, as if someone was carefully sneaking around the house. With trembling hands, Emily felt for her phone. There was no signal. The storm must have damaged the cell tower. The writer looked around in panic, searching for something to use for self-defense. Her gaze fell on a heavy table lamp. The footsteps were approaching the stairs to the second floor. Emily, clutching the lamp, froze by her bedroom door. Each second felt like an eternity. Suddenly, a deafening clap of thunder sounded, and the lights went out again. In absolute darkness, Emily heard someone slowly climbing the stairs. She held her breath, feeling her heart pounding furiously. The footsteps stopped right outside her bedroom door. For several agonizingly long seconds, nothing happened. Then the doorknob began to turn slowly. Emily, gasping with terror, gripped the lamp tighter. The door opened slightly, and a dark figure slipped into the room. At that moment, lightning illuminated the bedroom with bright light. Emily saw before her a tall man in wet clothes. His face was hidden by a hood, but the writer caught a glimpse of gleaming eyes staring directly at her. Without thinking, Emily struck the stranger with the lamp as hard as she could. There was a dull thud, and the man collapsed to the floor. The writer darted out of the bedroom and rushed down the stairs. She ran out of the house into the pouring rain, not knowing where she was going. Stumbling over tree roots, Emily ran through the forest, not looking back. Branches whipped her face, her clothes were soaked through, but she didn't stop. Finally, exhausted and shivering from cold and fear, the writer made it to the highway. Luckily, a truck was soon passing by. The driver, seeing a disheveled wet woman on the roadside, stopped and gave Emily a ride to the nearest town. There she went to the police. The sheriff and his deputies immediately drove out to the cottage. However, upon arrival, they found no trace of the intruder. The front door was locked from the inside, the windows intact. They found a broken lamp in the bedroom, but no signs of a struggle or the presence of an outsider in the house. The police suggested that Emily had imagined everything due to stress and loneliness. Perhaps she had accidentally left the basement window open herself. And the footsteps and figure in the bedroom could have been hallucinations brought on by fatigue and nervous tension. Emily couldn't believe that she had simply imagined it all. She clearly remembered the gleam in the stranger's eyes, the sound of the lamp striking. But there was no evidence, and the writer had to accept the police's version of events. A few days later, Emily returned to the cottage to collect her things. She decided not to stay there alone anymore and to go back home to the city. While packing her bags, the writer found a crumpled piece of paper in her jacket pocket. Unfolding it, she read a message scrawled in uneven handwriting. "I'll be back for you." Emily dropped the note in horror. She grabbed her bags and ran out of the house, not even closing the door. An hour later, she was speeding down the highway away from Vermont, vowing never to return to these woods. Months passed. Emily gradually recovered from the nightmare she had experienced and returned to work on her novel. But sometimes at night, she would wake up in a cold sweat, remembering that terrifying gaze in the darkness and the sinister promise. Fear of the unknown stalker wouldn't leave her, making her jump at every rustle outside the window and regard strangers with suspicion. This experience changed Emily's life forever, reminding her of the fragility of human peace of mind and that even in the most secluded places, we cannot always feel completely safe. Sarah Jenkins, a 32-year-old software developer, had been working from home for the past year in her quaint two-story house on the outskirts of Millbrook, New York. She enjoyed the peace and quiet of her semi-rural neighborhood, especially during the fall when the surrounding trees turned vibrant shades of red and gold. On a particularly gloomy October evening, Sarah was engrossed in her work, racing to meet a tight deadline. Outside, a fierce storm raged, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the trees. The weather forecast had warned of potential flooding and power outages, but Sarah paid little attention, focused intently on her computer screen. As the night wore on, the storm intensified. Around midnight, a loud crack of thunder made Sarah jump, momentarily breaking her concentration. She decided to take a short break and make some coffee to help her power through the rest of her work. While waiting for the coffee to brew, Sarah noticed a faint sound coming from the basement. At first, she dismissed it as the house settling or the wind playing tricks on her ears. But as she listened more closely, she could swear she heard the sound of water trickling. Concerned about potential flooding, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made her way down the creaky wooden stairs to the basement. The beam of light danced across the concrete floor, revealing small puddles forming near the far wall. As she approached to investigate, her blood ran cold. The water wasn't coming from outside. It was seeping in through a small window that was slightly ajar. Sarah was certain she had locked all the windows before the storm hit. Heart pounding, she moved closer to shut it, when suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the basement. In that split second, Sarah caught a glimpse of a dark figure crouching in the corner behind some old boxes. Panic gripped her as she stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure began to move, slowly rising to its feet. Sarah's mind raced. How long had this intruder been in her house? How did they get in without her noticing? She bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone to call 911, only to discover there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. Sarah's eyes darted around the kitchen, searching for a weapon. She grabbed a large knife from the counter, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. The house had fallen eerily silent, save for the pounding of rain on the roof and the frantic beating of her own heart. Suddenly, she heard the basement door slowly creaking open. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs, each one bringing the intruder closer. Sarah backed away, her mind frantically trying to formulate a plan. She considered making a run for the front door, but fear paralyzed her. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Sarah held her breath, the knife shaking in her hand. A tall, shadowy figure emerged from the basement doorway, water dripping from its rain-soaked clothes. The dim light from the kitchen window revealed a man's face, gaunt and wild-eyed, with a scraggly beard and matted hair. The intruder's eyes locked onto Sarah, an unsettling grin spreading across his face. He took a step forward, raising a hand that clutched a rusty pair of scissors. Sarah's survival instincts kicked in. She hurled her coffee mug at the man's head and darted towards the living room. The intruder let out an inhuman growl, giving chase. Sarah could hear him right behind her as she raced up the stairs, taking them two at a time. She sprinted into her bedroom, slamming the door shut and quickly pushing her dresser in front of it. The man began pounding on the door, the wood splintering under the force of his blows. Sarah frantically searched for an escape route. The window was her only option. She could climb onto the roof of the porch and hopefully make it to her car. Just as she was about to open the window, the bedroom door burst open, the dresser toppling over. The intruder lunged at Sarah, scissors raised. In a desperate move, she swung the knife, catching him across the arm. He howled in pain, momentarily stunned. Sarah seized the opportunity and dove past him, tumbling into the hallway. She scrambled to her feet and raced down the stairs, the man's enraged shouts echoing behind her. She reached the front door, fumbling with the locks with shaking hands. Finally, the door swung open and Sarah plunged into the storm. Rain immediately soaked her to the bone as she sprinted across her front yard towards her car. Behind her, she could hear the intruder's heavy footsteps splashing through puddles. Sarah reached her car, yanking on the door handle, only to remember with horror that her keys were still inside the house. The intruder was closing in, his twisted face visible in the flashes of lightning. With no other choice, Sarah ran down the street, screaming for help. The few houses on her street were dark, their occupants either asleep or away. Sarah's lungs burned as she ran, the cold rain stinging her face. She could hear the man behind her, his labored breathing getting closer. Just as Sarah felt her strength failing, she saw headlights approaching. A police cruiser turned onto the street, responding to reports of downed power lines in the area. Sarah waved her arms frantically, screaming for help. The police car screeched to a halt, and 2 officers jumped out, weapons drawn. Sarah collapsed to her knees, pointing back towards her pursuer. But when she turned to look, the street behind her was empty. The intruder had vanished into the night. The officers quickly ushered Sarah into their car and called for backup. They searched the area thoroughly but found no trace of the man. Sarah's house showed clear signs of a break-in, with muddy footprints throughout the basement and kitchen. In the days that followed, the police investigation turned up disturbing information. Several similar break-ins had occurred in neighboring towns over the past few months. The description of the intruder matched that of a patient who had escaped from a nearby psychiatric facility weeks earlier. Sarah couldn't bring herself to return to her house. The memory of that terrifying night haunted her dreams. She moved in with her parents in the city, unable to shake the feeling of vulnerability that came with living alone. Months passed, and slowly, Sarah began to rebuild her sense of security. She found a new job in the city and started looking for an apartment. But just as she was beginning to put the ordeal behind her, a letter arrived at her parents' house. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words cut out from magazines, forming a chilling message: "I'll find you again. Soon." The police were never able to locate the intruder. To this day, Sarah lives with the constant fear that one day she'll look over her shoulder and see that wild-eyed face grinning back at her. The night of terror in Millbrook serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear are all too real, waiting for the perfect moment to strike when we're at our most vulnerable. Alex Foster, a 28-year-old software engineer, had always dreamed of a peaceful retreat where he could work remotely and escape the hustle of city life. When he stumbled upon an ad for a secluded cabin rental in the dense forests of northern Washington state, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. The listing promised high-speed internet, modern amenities, and most importantly, solitude. Without hesitation, Alex booked the cabin for a month-long stay. As October rolled in, Alex packed his bags and made the long drive from Seattle to the remote cabin. The winding forest road seemed to go on forever, trees looming on either side, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. By the time he arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the small clearing where the cabin stood. The cabin was everything Alex had hoped for: rustic on the outside, but surprisingly modern inside. He quickly set up his workstation and settled into a routine. Days were spent coding and attending virtual meetings, while evenings were reserved for relaxing by the fire pit outside, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the sounds of the forest. 2 weeks into his stay, the weather took a turn for the worse. Dark clouds rolled in, bringing with them a torrential downpour that lasted for days. Alex didn't mind the rain provided a soothing backdrop to his work. However, as the storm intensified, he began to feel increasingly isolated. The constant patter of rain on the roof and the howling wind through the trees seemed to amplify the cabin's remoteness. On the 4th night of the storm, Alex was working late, trying to meet a project deadline. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault of the wind, but he had grown accustomed to the noises. Around midnight, he decided to take a break and make some coffee. As he waited for the water to boil, a flash of lightning illuminated the kitchen, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that made the whole cabin shudder. In that brief moment of illumination, Alex could have sworn he saw a figure standing just outside the kitchen window. His heart raced as he peered into the darkness, straining to see through the rain-streaked glass. Another flash of lightning revealed nothing but the swaying trees and sheets of rain. Unsettled but trying to rationalize what he'd seen, Alex poured his coffee and returned to his laptop. He tried to focus on his work, but found his eyes constantly drawn to the windows, searching the darkness beyond. The storm seemed to be getting worse, wind howling like a wounded animal. Suddenly, the power flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Alex fumbled for his phone, using its flashlight to navigate to the kitchen where he kept some candles. As he lit them, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the distinct creak of a floorboard from the front porch. Frozen in place, Alex listened intently. There it was again, another creak, followed by the sound of something scraping against the front door. His mind raced through possibilities. Could it be an animal seeking shelter from the storm? But deep down, he knew this was something else entirely. With trembling hands, Alex picked up a kitchen knife and slowly made his way to the front door. The scraping sound had stopped, but he could hear heavy breathing on the other side. Gathering his courage, he quickly flicked on the porch light and yanked the door open. The porch was empty. Rain poured down in sheets, obscuring his view of the surrounding forest. Alex was about to close the door when something caught his eye, a set of muddy footprints leading away from the porch and disappearing into the darkness. Heart-pounding, Alex slammed the door shut and locked it. He rushed around the cabin, checking all the windows and doors to make sure they were secure. As he reached the back door, he noticed with horror that it was slightly ajar. Had it been open this whole time, or had someone or something just been inside? Alex grabbed his phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. He was truly alone, cut off from the outside world. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he found himself gasping for air. A loud thud from upstairs snapped Alex back to his senses. Someone was in the cabin with him. Gripping the knife tightly, he slowly made his way up the creaking stairs, every shadow seeming to come alive in the flickering candlelight. The upper floor consisted of 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom. Alex checked them one by one, his terror mounting with each empty room. As he entered the last bedroom, a gust of wind blew through an open window, extinguishing his candle. In the sudden darkness, he heard a raspy breath right behind him. Alex whirled around, slashing wildly with the knife. He felt it connect with something solid, followed by an inhuman shriek that chilled him to his core. In a panic, he ran blindly, tumbling down the stairs and out the front door into the raging storm. Rain lashed at his face as Alex ran through the forest, branches whipping at his skin. He had no idea where he was going. His only thought was to get as far away from the cabin as possible. Behind him, he could hear something crashing through the underbrush, giving chase. Alex ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. In a flash of lightning, he saw a tall, emaciated figure with impossibly long limbs bounding after him, covering ground at an alarming rate. Just as Alex felt his strength giving out, he spotted lights in the distance. A wave of relief washed over him. It was the main road. He pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his muscles and the terror clawing at his mind. As he burst out of the tree line onto the road, headlights appeared in the distance. Alex waved his arms frantically, screaming for help. The car, a police cruiser, screeched to a halt beside him. 2 officers jumped out, hands on their weapons as Alex babbled about the creature chasing him. The officers looked past Alex into the dark forest, seeing nothing but rain and swaying trees. They ushered the terrified man into their car, concerned by his wild eyes and the knife still clutched in his shaking hand. As they drove Alex to the nearest hospital, he kept looking back, certain that at any moment he would see that nightmarish figure emerging from the woods. At the hospital, doctors found no serious injuries on Alex, apart from cuts and bruises from his frantic run through the forest. They attributed his experience to a combination of stress, isolation, and the extreme weather conditions. Alex insisted on what he had seen, but his story was met with skepticism. The police investigated the cabin the next day but found nothing out of the ordinary. There were no signs of an intruder, and the muddy footprints Alex had seen had been washed away by the rain. The case was eventually closed, chalked up to an overactive imagination and the harsh reality of prolonged isolation. Alex returned to Seattle, but he was a changed man. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, jumping at every shadow and unexpected noise. He tried to convince himself that it had all been in his head, but deep down, he knew the truth. Something had been in that forest, something that defied explanation. Months passed, and slowly, Alex began to rebuild his life. He threw himself into his work, trying to forget the nightmarish experience. But just as he was starting to feel normal again, a package arrived at his apartment. Inside was a single pine branch and a note written in crude, childlike scrawl. "I remember your scent. Do you remember mine?" The police were called, but once again, they found no evidence of a crime. The package had no return address, and the post office had no record of who had sent it. Alex was left with a gnawing fear that whatever he had encountered in those woods had followed him home. From that day forward, Alex never felt truly safe again. He moved to a bustling city center, surrounded himself with people, and never spent a night alone. But no matter where he went or what he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the shadows of the night, something was waiting and remembering. The experience in the cabin had shattered Alex's perception of reality. He now knew that the world was far stranger and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The comfort of rationality and logic had been stripped away, leaving him vulnerable in a universe where nightmares could become real. Alex's story spread through whispered conversations and online forums dedicated to the unexplained. Some dismissed it as the ravings of a man who had succumbed to isolation and paranoia. Others saw it as proof of something sinister lurking in the dark corners of the world. For those who heard Alex's tale, the forests of northern Washington took on a more sinister aspect. Hikers reported strange noises in the night, and there were increased sightings of an unnaturally tall, thin figure moving through the trees. The local tourism industry suffered as people became wary of venturing too deep into the woods. Years later, Alex received a call from a journalist investigating a series of disappearances in the area around the cabin. People had been vanishing without a trace, their belongings found scattered through the forest. As the journalist described the cases, Alex felt the old terror rising within him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his bones, that whatever he had encountered that stormy night was still out there, and it was hungry. The story of Alex Foster and the thing in the woods became a modern folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking in the wilderness. But for Alex, it was no story. It was a nightmare that he lived with every day, a shadow that followed him, no matter how brightly the sun shone. In the end, Alex's experience serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we can't explain, the shadows that move when they shouldn't, the whispers in the wind that sound almost like words, and the lingering doubt that maybe, just maybe, we're not as alone in this world as we'd like to believe.